The summer heat hung heavy over the small town of Meadowbrook, Virginia, as Sarah Mitchell walked out of Riverside Medical Center for the last time. Her scrubs were still crisp, her name badge still clipped to her chest, but none of that mattered anymore. She had just been fired. At 48 years old, Sarah had dedicated 25 years of her life to nursing. 15 of those years had been spent serving as an Army combat medic in Iraq and Afghanistan, where she had saved countless lives under impossible conditions. The remaining 10 years she had worked at Riverside, bringing that same dedication and skill to the patients of her hometown. But today, none of that counted for anything. "I'm sorry, Sarah," Mr. Henderson, the hospital administrator, had said without meeting her eyes. "We're making budget cuts. Last hired, first fired. That's just how it works." Sarah had stared at him in disbelief. "Last hired? Tom, I've been here for 10 years. "Yes, but Mrs. Pemberton's nephew just joined us 6 months ago, and well, he's family." Henderson had shuffled papers on his desk, still avoiding her gaze. "Besides, we need to make room for younger staff, fresh perspectives." The real reason hung unspoken in the air between them. Mrs. Pemberton, the hospital board chair, had never liked Sarah. The wealthy widow had made that clear from day one. Sarah was too direct, too confident, too willing to speak up when she saw problems. Women like Mrs. Pemberton preferred nurses who smiled sweetly and never questioned anything. Last week had been the final straw. Sarah had reported serious concerns about medication errors in the cardiac unit, errors that put patients at risk. Mrs. Pemberton's nephew worked in that unit. Instead of investigating the problem, Mrs. Pemberton had decided to eliminate the whistleblower. Now Sarah walked down Main Street, her small box of personal belongings tucked under one arm. She had driven to work that morning, but her car had broken down in the parking lot when she tried to leave. The mechanic said it would take 3 days to get the part needed for repairs. So she walked, just like she had walked countless miles during her military service. The afternoon sun beat down on the sidewalk. Sarah's feet ached in her nursing shoes, but she kept moving. Her small house was 5 miles away on the edge of town. She had made longer marches in the desert carrying a full pack. She could handle this. As she passed the town square, she noticed people staring. Some whispered to each other. News traveled fast in Meadowbrook. By tomorrow, everyone would know that Sarah Mitchell had been fired. Some would assume she had done something wrong. Others would know the truth but would say nothing, afraid of crossing Mrs. Pemberton. "Hey, Sarah," a voice called out. She turned to see Danny Peterson, a young man she had treated in the emergency room 2 years ago after a motorcycle accident. She had worked a double shift to make sure he got through his surgery safely. "I heard what happened," Danny said, jogging over. "That's messed up. You saved my life. Everyone knows you're the best nurse in this town." Sarah managed a small smile. "Thanks, Danny, I appreciate that. You need a ride?" "My house is just a few miles. The walk will do me good." Danny nodded, understanding. "Well, if you change your mind, you call me, okay?" Sarah continued walking, touched by the kindness but still angry at the injustice. She had given everything to her patients, to this hospital, to this town. She had put her life on the line for her country. And this was how it ended, fired to make room for an incompetent nephew who couldn't even file patient charts correctly. The houses thinned out as she reached the outskirts of town. Fields stretched out on both sides of the road, golden wheat swaying in the breeze. Sarah shifted the box to her other arm and kept walking. Her mind drifted back to her years in the Army. She remembered the chaos of the field hospitals, the constant sound of helicopters bringing in wounded soldiers. She remembered working 30-hour shifts, sleeping in her boots, making life-or-death decisions with limited supplies and no backup. She remembered holding the hands of dying 19-year-old boys, promising to write to their mothers. She had earned a Bronze Star for her actions during an attack on her base in Afghanistan. When the hospital came under fire, Sarah had refused to evacuate, staying behind to care for patients who couldn't be moved. She had performed emergency surgery in a bunker while explosions shook the walls around her. 3 soldiers had lived because of her courage that night. That medal sat in a drawer at home now, forgotten by everyone except Sarah herself. Apparently, bravery didn't count for much when you challenged a wealthy woman's family. The sound of distant engines broke through her thoughts. Sarah glanced up at the sky, a habit from her military days. 2 black shapes appeared on the horizon, growing larger. Helicopters. That was odd. Meadowbrook was too small to have regular helicopter traffic. The nearest hospital with a helipad was 30 miles away in Richmond. The helicopters grew closer, their distinctive thump-thump-thump echoing across the empty fields. Sarah stopped walking and watched. Something about their flight pattern seemed purposeful, directed. They weren't just passing overhead. They were coming toward her. Sarah's heart began to race. The helicopters descended rapidly, heading straight for the field beside the road. Dust and wheat chaff exploded into the air as the first helicopter touched down, followed seconds later by the second. Before the rotors had even stopped spinning, the doors flew open. Men in military uniforms jumped out, some in army fatigues, others in dress blues. More than a dozen people emerged from the 2 aircraft. Sarah stood frozen on the side of the road, her box of belongings clutched against her chest. What was happening? "Where's the nurse?" A voice boomed over the sound of the dying engines. "Where's Sergeant Sarah Mitchell?" A tall man in an army colonel's uniform strode toward her, his chest covered in medals. Behind him came more officers, some she didn't recognize. And then she saw a face she did know, Major David Chen, a surgeon she had worked with in Kandahar. "Sarah," David broke into a run, covering the distance between them in seconds. "Thank God we found you." "David, what's going on?" Sarah's voice came out barely above a whisper. The colonel reached her, snapping to attention and rendering a sharp salute. "Sergeant Mitchell, I'm Colonel James Reeves from Walter Reed Medical Center. We've been searching for you for the past 4 hours." Sarah automatically returned the salute muscle memory from her years of service. "Sir, I don't understand." "We need you, Sergeant," Colonel Reeves said. "There's been a major accident at Fort Monroe. A training exercise went wrong, an explosion. We have 17 critically wounded soldiers, and the medical facility there is overwhelmed. Every available trauma nurse within 200 miles has been called in." David stepped forward. "Sarah, when they started calling for experienced combat medics, your name came up immediately. Multiple people recommended you, soldiers you served with, doctors you worked alongside. We went to the hospital first. They told us you'd been let go today. We've been driving around town trying to find you. Someone at the gas station said they saw you walking this direction," another officer added. "We commandeered these helicopters from the National Guard base." Sarah's mind reeled. "But I'm not active duty anymore. I've been out for 10 years. "We know," Colonel Reeves said, "but this is an emergency situation. We're authorized to bring in civilian contractors with military medical experience. We're asking you to come with us right now. Lives are at stake, Sergeant. Soldiers are dying." The box slipped from Sarah's arms, her personal belongings scattering on the dusty road, framed photos, a coffee mug, a small plant. None of it mattered. "When do we leave?" Sarah asked. "Right now." Colonel Reeves gestured toward the nearest helicopter. "We'll brief you on the way." Sarah didn't hesitate. She walked toward the helicopter, and David fell into step beside her. "I knew you'd say yes," he said quietly. "You never could turn your back on soldiers who needed help." As Sarah climbed into the helicopter, she glanced back at the scattered contents of her box lying on the roadside. That life, Riverside Medical Center, Mrs. Pemberton, the politics and pettiness, suddenly seemed very far away and very small. The helicopter lifted off, and through the window, Sarah could see the town of Meadowbrook shrinking below her. Somewhere down there, Mrs. Pemberton was probably having tea, satisfied that she had eliminated a troublesome employee. She had no idea that the woman she had fired was about to save 17 lives. Colonel Reeves handed Sarah a tablet showing medical charts and injury reports. As she scanned the information, her training kicked in. She began mentally triaging patients, planning treatment protocols, assessing resource needs. This was what she had been trained to do. This was who she really was. "How bad is it?" she asked David. "Bad, burns, shrapnel wounds, traumatic amputations, crush injuries. The kind of casualties you remember from deployment." Sarah nodded grimly. She did remember. Those memories never really left. "The facility at Fort Monroe has good doctors, but most of them have never worked in combat conditions," Colonel Reeves explained. "They're excellent surgeons in a clean, controlled environment, but this situation is chaos. We need people who can function in that chaos. People like you." "Who else is coming?" Sarah asked. "6 other combat medics and nurses we've pulled in from around the region, but you're the most experienced. You served 3 tours, earned commendations for treating mass casualty events. You're exactly what we need right now." The helicopter banked, heading northeast toward Fort Monroe. Sarah's hands were steady as she continued reviewing the casualty reports, but inside, emotions swirled. Hours ago, she had been deemed expendable, not worth keeping on staff at a small-town hospital. Now she was being told she was essential, that lives depended on her skills and experience. The helicopter descended toward Fort Monroe as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Below, Sarah could see the sprawling military base, and near the medical facility, she spotted what looked like a field hospital setup: large tents, ambulances, and dozens of people moving with urgent purpose. The moment the helicopter touched down, Sarah was in motion. A young lieutenant met her at the door with a medical kit and body armor. "Sergeant Mitchell, this way." Sarah strapped on the armor as she ran, falling back into the rhythm she had known so well during her deployments. The smell hit her first: blood, antiseptic, and smoke. Then the sounds: shouted orders, groans of pain, the steady beep of medical monitors. Inside the main tent, organized chaos reigned. Sarah took it all in with a practiced eye. 4 operating tables were already in use. Nurses and medics moved between patients on gurneys, starting IVs and administering pain medication. A doctor Sarah didn't recognize stood in the center, coordinating care, his face streaked with sweat. David appeared at her side. "That's Dr. Morrison, the chief surgeon here. Good man, but he's overwhelmed." Sarah approached Dr. Morrison. "Sir, Sergeant Mitchell reporting. What do you need?" Morrison looked up, relief flooding his features. "Major Chen vouched for you. Can you handle the critical cases in the back tent? We've got 3 soldiers who need immediate attention, but I don't have enough experienced hands." "Yes, sir." Sarah grabbed a nurse and headed to the back tent. What she found there would have broken most people. 3 young soldiers, none older than 25, all with severe injuries. A specialist with extensive burns. A private first class with a traumatic leg amputation. A sergeant with shrapnel embedded throughout his chest and abdomen. For a moment, Sarah stood still, taking it all in. Then her training took over. "You," she pointed to the nurse, "get me a surgical kit, 4 units of O-negative blood, and another medic. Now." Sarah moved to the soldier with the amputation first. He was losing blood too quickly. She tied off the femoral artery with practiced hands, started an IV, and began stabilizing him for surgery. The whole time, she talked to him in a calm, steady voice. "What's your name, soldier?" "Thompson," he gasped through clenched teeth. "PFC Marcus Thompson." "Well, Marcus, you're going to be fine. I've seen worse injuries than this in Kandahar, and those soldiers walked out of my hospital. You're going to walk again too. Do you understand me?" "Yes, ma'am." Another medic arrived, and Sarah directed him to stay with Thompson while she moved to the burn victim. The specialist's name was Rodriguez, and he was drifting in and out of consciousness. "Stay with me, Rodriguez," Sarah commanded. "That's an order. You don't have permission to check out on me." For the next 6 hours, Sarah worked without stopping. She moved between patients, prioritizing care, making split-second decisions about who needed treatment first. She sutured wounds, administered medications, assisted in emergency surgeries, and supervised less experienced medical staff. Around midnight, Colonel Reeves checked on her. "Sergeant, you need to take a break." "Not yet, sir," Sarah replied, not looking up from the wound she was cleaning. "These soldiers need me." "Sarah," David said gently, appearing beside the colonel, "you've been at this for 6 hours straight. You need food and water at minimum." Sarah finally paused, becoming aware of her shaking hands and empty stomach. 5 minutes, she conceded. They led her to a small area where someone had set up coffee and sandwiches. Sarah ate mechanically, her mind still on her patients. "You were magnificent in there," David said, "just like I remembered from Kandahar." "How are the numbers?" Sarah asked. "All 17 are stable now," Colonel Reeves said. 3 are critical but holding. The rest will make full recoveries. Dr. Morrison said that without you, we would have lost at least 3, maybe 4 soldiers tonight. Sarah took another bite of her sandwich. "That's what I do." "It's more than that," Reeves said. "You brought order to chaos. Half the staff in there are young doctors who have never dealt with mass casualties. They were panicking. You showed them how it's done." Sarah finished her sandwich and stood. "I need to check on Rodriguez again. His burns need monitoring." She worked through the night and into the next morning. By dawn, all 17 soldiers were stable. Sarah had personally overseen the care of the 5 most critical cases, and all 5 were going to survive. As the sun rose over Fort Monroe, Dr. Morrison called a meeting of all medical staff. Sarah stood in the back, exhausted but satisfied. "I want to thank everyone who responded to this emergency," Morrison began. "Particularly the civilian contractors who dropped everything to come help. You saved lives today." He gestured toward Sarah. "Sergeant Mitchell, would you come up here, please?" Sarah reluctantly walked to the front, uncomfortable with the attention. Morrison continued. "This woman worked for 12 straight hours without a break. She stabilized 5 critical patients, assisted in 7 surgeries, and trained our younger staff in combat trauma protocols. 3 of the soldiers in this facility owe their lives directly to her actions." The gathered medical personnel applauded. Sarah nodded, still not comfortable with praise. Colonel Reeves stepped forward. "Sergeant Mitchell, on behalf of the United States Army and the 17 soldiers you helped save today, thank you. Your service continues to honor this nation." "Just doing my job, sir," Sarah replied. After the meeting, Sarah finally allowed herself to rest. She dozed for a few hours in a small office, then woke to check on her patients again. Marcus Thompson, the PFC with the amputation, was awake and asking for her. "Sergeant Mitchell," he said when she entered his room, "the doc said you saved my life." Sarah pulled up a chair beside his bed. "You're a fighter, Marcus. You did the hard part by staying alive long enough for us to help you." "They said I'll walk again, with a prosthetic." "You will. I know a veteran in my hometown who lost his leg in Iraq. Now he runs marathons. You're young and strong. You'll do even better." Marcus's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you, I was so scared, but you were so calm, like you knew everything would be okay." Sarah patted his hand. "I've been doing this a long time, son, and I've learned that our soldiers are tougher than they think they are." Later that afternoon, David found Sarah in the recovery ward, checking on patients. "You have a visitor," he said with an odd smile. Sarah followed him outside to find a small delegation waiting. Colonel Reeves stood with several other officers, but Sarah's attention fixed on the woman standing slightly apart from the group. Mrs. Pemberton. The hospital board chair looked uncomfortable in her expensive suit and pearls, completely out of place on a military base. Beside her stood Mr. Henderson, the administrator who had fired Sarah. "Mrs. Pemberton," Sarah said coolly, "I'm surprised to see you here." "Sergeant Mitchell," Mrs. Pemberton began, her voice lacking its usual arrogance. That is, we, the hospital board." Colonel Reeves stepped forward. "Mrs. Pemberton called me this morning. Apparently, news of yesterday's events has spread. When she learned that the nurse who helped save 17 soldiers was the same woman her hospital fired yesterday, she requested a meeting." Mrs. Pemberton looked like she had swallowed something sour. "Sergeant Mitchell, the board has reconsidered your termination. We would like to offer you your position back, with a promotion to head nurse and a significant salary increase." Sarah crossed her arms. "Is that so?" Henderson jumped in. "Sarah, we made a mistake, a terrible mistake. We had no idea about your military background, your medals, your experience." "You never asked," Sarah interrupted. "In 10 years, you never once asked about my service. You just saw a middle-aged woman who spoke her mind too much." Mrs. Pemberton flinched. I admit we may have acted hastily." "You fired me to cover up medication errors," Sarah said bluntly. "You chose protecting your nephew over protecting patients. That's not hasty. That's corrupt." The officers standing nearby looked at Mrs. Pemberton with new understanding and clear disapproval. "Now wait just a minute," Henderson started. "No, you wait," Sarah said firmly. "I spent yesterday walking home in the heat, carrying a box of my belongings, after you threw away 10 years of dedicated service. Then I spent the night saving lives that actually mattered. I remembered what it feels like to work somewhere that values skill and courage over politics and nepotism." Colonel Reeves stepped beside Sarah. "Mrs. Pemberton, I think you should know that we've offered Sergeant Mitchell a position as a civilian trauma training instructor at Walter Reed Medical Center. She would be teaching combat medicine to military medical staff. The position comes with full benefits, a salary double what your hospital was paying her, and the respect she deserves." Sarah turned to Reeves in surprise. "Sir." "We discussed it this morning," Reeves said. "You're exactly what our program needs. Someone with real combat experience who can teach the next generation, if you're interested." Sarah looked back at Mrs. Pemberton and Henderson. Both looked stricken, realizing they had lost. "I appreciate your offer," Sarah said to Mrs. Pemberton, "but I decline. I'm going to work somewhere that my experience is valued and where I can make a real difference." She turned to Colonel Reeves. "Sir, I accept your offer. When do I start?" Reeves smiled. 2 weeks. That gives you time to relocate to Maryland." As Mrs. Pemberton and Henderson drove away in defeat, David clapped Sarah on the shoulder. "Feels good, doesn't it?" he asked. "What?" "Justice." Sarah smiled, really smiled, for the first time in days. Yeah, it does." 3 weeks later, Sarah Mitchell stood in front of a classroom at Walter Reed Medical Center, facing 30 young medics and nurses about to deploy to combat zones. On the wall behind her hung her Bronze Star and her other commendations, finally displayed with pride. "Good morning," she began. "My name is Sergeant Sarah Mitchell, and I'm going to teach you how to save lives under the worst conditions imaginable. Some of you will face situations that terrify you. You'll have limited supplies, terrible conditions, and more casualties than you think you can handle. But I'm going to show you that you can handle it, because that's what we do. We don't give up. We don't walk away. And we never, ever leave our soldiers behind." The students listened with rapt attention as Sarah began her first lesson, sharing hard-won knowledge from the battlefield. That evening, Sarah sat in her new apartment in Maryland, looking at a letter that had arrived that day. It was from Marcus Thompson, the PFC she had saved. He was recovering well and had been fitted for his prosthetic. He wrote that he was determined to stay in the army and that Sarah had inspired him never to give up. Sarah pinned the letter to her refrigerator, next to a photo from Fort Monroe showing her surrounded by the 17 soldiers she had helped save. They were all smiling, alive and healing. Her phone rang. It was Danny Peterson from Meadowbrook. "Sarah, I heard about your new job. That's amazing." "Thanks, Danny. How's everything back home?" "You'll love this," Danny said with clear delight in his voice. "Mrs. Pemberton resigned from the hospital board last week. Turns out when people heard she fired you, they were furious. The local veterans organization started a petition, and half the town signed it. She couldn't handle the pressure. And her nephew, fired after they investigated those medication errors you reported. Turns out he'd been making mistakes that could have killed people. You were right all along." Sarah leaned back in her chair, allowing herself a moment of satisfaction. Good. Maybe they'll start prioritizing patient care over politics. After hanging up, Sarah walked to her window and looked out at the lights of the city. Tomorrow she would teach another class, sharing her knowledge with the next generation of combat medics. She would help them prepare for the hardest job in the world, the job she had done with honor for so many years. She had been fired, humiliated, and dismissed. But she had also been found again, valued again, and given the chance to serve in a new way. Sarah Mitchell smiled. Sometimes justice came in the form of 2 helicopters landing in a wheat field, voices calling out for a nurse who refused to be forgotten. Sometimes being underestimated was the setup for the greatest comeback.